In this session, we are going to talk about the brain. And one of the ways that people have popularly thought about the brain is, you've probably heard it before, like more left brain dominant or more right brain dominant. And in that way, people talk about the left brain as more rational, logical, linguistic type of processing, and the right brain is more emotional, more holistic. It's kind of like the thinker on one side and the artist on another. In general, though, it is interesting to see how the brain works and how information flows in the brain. You know, one of the things that often gets dismissed or ignored is the fact that as the pinnacle of his creation, human beings are real material, corporeal, actual physical beings who are embodied. And God has given us bodies, and he's inside of our body has given us physical processes that shape the way that we interact with him, with ourselves, with the world that we live in, with others. And in order for us to grow in the knowledge of God, intricately linked to that is for us to grow in the knowledge of ourselves. And so as we're working through, hey, what is it actually like to interact with God there are actual physical processes that we now understand in deeper ways that we think are going to be really helpful for you. And we just believe that the more deeply we understand the actual physical process that God himself gave us, that you actually will grow in the knowledge of God, and to grow in the ways that both you're able to identify ways that you've been malformed, but then also grow in the reality of the depth of God's love for you. And so in this session, what we're going to do is we're just going to talk about that physical process. How has God made our brains, and how does information flow, and what are we to understand based on how information flows? So when you think about the brain, I don't want you to think about just the gray material that's housed inside of your skull. When you think about the brain, think about the entire body. So as soon as you have an experience through the nervous system, then your body encodes that information, sends it up the spinal cord into the lower third of your brain. Now, the lower third of your brain, as you can see in this image, is called the lower reptilian complex. That's made up of your spinal cord, your brain stem, and your cerebellum. This part of the brain is responsible for everything that's preconscious, subconscious. It's all of the instinctual things that we do as human beings, like breathe, like sleep, like fight, flight, freeze. A lot of times, this is where we'll call it like a spidey sense or something like that. It's where, if you've ever been driving on the road and somebody pulls over into your lane, and you will sense that car pulling into your lane before you're ever consciously aware that there is actual danger going on, and your body will actually respond before you're aware of your response. And that's what's happening. That data is being sent up, and your body is reacting to a dangerous situation before you're ever conscious of it. That's the preconscious, instinctual behavior that all of us have. It's also the reason why, you guys know what I'm talking about, sometimes you're standing there and somebody comes up and stands behind you, and you can't see them, but you just sense, like there's something about it where you sense that somebody is there. And they totally are, right? It's kind of that spidey sense that God has given to all of us. That's that lower, what they call the reptilian complex, the spinal cord, brainstem, and cerebellum. The information flows from the bottom, so from your fingers and toes, right? From the bottom up. You never have information in your brainstem without it first coming from your body. So we never think from the top down. We're bottom up kind of thinking creatures. So as information travels from bottom up through the brainstem, then it goes into a part of the brain that's called the limbic system. Now, the limbic system is made up of two primary components. The first one is called your hippocampus. And the hippocampus, just think of it like it's something that integrates things together. It's Kurt Thompson said, he calls it the puzzle piece assembler. It takes, if you dump a puzzle out onto the table and there's 1,000 pieces, the hippocampus is the part of your brain that goes, ooh, we got to put all this together. Start looking for corners. You know what I'm saying? Like put the pieces together. And once it puts the pieces together, then it's able to pass that information along to the cortical region of the brain, that higher region where you become conscious of it and aware of it, and you can actually start playing with that information in explicit thought. Now, the other part of the limbic system is called the amygdala. And the amygdala is literally designed to squirt this hormone called cortisol onto your brain. And it literally makes you dumber. Like you become a dumber human being when the amygdala is functioning at a really high rate. The reason it's doing that is because the amygdala is your body's natural defense mechanism that senses danger from the brainstem and will shut down higher levels of thinking so that you can be in an elevated state of awareness of all of the threats that are around you. And so that's why typically when people are in a fear response or there's some kind of excited response, if you ask them basic questions, they have a harder time processing it because of the fear response or the insecurity that they're feeling. Their brain is actually in a lower state of processing than it normally would be if the hippocampus was functioning properly in that moment. And so while the hippocampus integrates stuff and passes it along so that you can actually process the information, the amygdala keeps that information disintegrated so that you can protect yourself in an immediate defense response based on the situation that you're in. Now, the last part of the brain is what's known as the neocortex. And the neocortex is made up of multiple lobes, but the two primary ones are the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. Now, this is super important because you need to understand how information flows. Once it goes from the brainstem through the limbic system, before it ever gets to the left hemisphere, it first travels through the right hemisphere. And while there's a lot of conversation that's gone on about left and right side of the brain and all that kind of stuff, to make a point here, I'm going to overgeneralize and say that the right side of the brain is primarily implicit, holistic, experiential, emotional, and you're going to see the world through the right brain in a very holistic way. You're not going to get down into granular details in the right side of your brain. However, you are going to have an emotional experience of something in the right side of your brain. Now, if the information is passed along by your hippocampus through the right side of your brain, then it travels with ease because the amygdala is not firing. And so it travels with ease to the left side of the brain where you can put it into an explicit, cohesive, linear story that makes a lot of sense, right? And then it can come to rest in the highest form of thought in your brain, which is called the prefrontal cortex. And that's where you play with ideas. So if the right side of the brain is, I'm having an emotional experience of something, and the left side of the brain is, oh, okay, now I'm aware of my emotions that I'm having about an experience. The prefrontal cortex is, okay, now what am I going to do with my awareness of what's happening? So some of you guys right now are going, man, why in the world are we talking about neuroscience again? And it's interesting because a lot of times I'll hear people say like, yeah, I'm just not very emotional. Man, give me the facts. I want to know the facts, but I'm just not very emotional. And the first thing I would say is that because we understand how information flows in the brain, this is like not negotiable. It's not like you can change the way that information flows in your brain. And so instead of us trying to manipulate it, instead, I think through this exercise, we're trying to gain a deeper understanding of it. And given the fact that we're bottom-up creatures and that we're also right to left thinking creatures, then the conclusion that we can draw from that is before you ever have an explicit thought in your left cortical hemisphere, you have first already had an emotional response in your right cortical hemisphere, which means before you're ever a thinking creature, you're a feeling creature. And if there's anything that the 21st century or just modernity, post-enlightenment modernity has done is they have flipped the script on that to where they're like, hey, you don't really have to pay attention to your emotion. You just need the facts, the cold, hard facts. Just give me rationality, just give me logic, just give me language, and I'm good. And what I'm saying is, hey, you can try to function like that, but you're actually, by doing that, you're actually trying to spin the earth in the opposite direction. Like, good luck with that. That's not the way that we are created. We are created as emotional, experiential creatures first, before we ever become logical, linear, linguistic creatures. Now, the other thing about this is that because of trauma, because of negative experiences that people have had that are embodied, right? You don't have a negative experience and it's some ethereal, disembodied experience. No. It's embodied. It gets stored in your body. So when you think about the flow of information and that raw data of experiences coming up through your nervous system, spinal cord, brainstem, into the limbic system, if it's a negative experience and the amygdala suppresses your hippocampus's activity to integrate things into a cohesive whole, then what ends up happening is that information stays disintegrated and it actually gets stuck because of the limbic system, because of the amygdala, it gets stuck in the right hemisphere that is subconscious, implicit, emotional, experiential. Now, a lot of you guys are kind of like, well, what does that look like? Well, I think there's the old saying of, if it's hysterical, it's historical. and you're kind of like, yeah, I've heard that before, but that's what that means. Like if you find yourself having an oversized reaction to something, to some kind of experience or to some kind of emotion, then that's your body's way of pointing you to go, hey, there's actually stuck trauma here. You are reliving trauma from the past in the present. And that's filtering the way that you're seeing what's actually going on in reality in front of you right now. And that's not my opinion. That's not somebody else's opinion. That's just a neurobiological fact. And unless we understand that from the flow of information and how stuff gets stuck in the brain, then a lot of times we're just going to live out a narrative about ourselves and about God and about others that's going to be filtered through a lot of woundedness that we've never dealt with before. We don't even know that we have a sense that it's there, but we haven't named it yet. We haven't noticed it. We haven't named it. We haven't brought it out into the light and actually dealt with it. That's just a neurobiological, physiological fact. Now, our experiences, both our positive and negative experiences through the flow of information, they obviously form the foundation of what we've talked about previously, which is called our autobiographical memory. Again, it's an incomplete picture, but it is a picture of the way that we view the world. It informs who we think we are, who we think God is, who we think others are. And it deeply affects the way that we live our lives, and it deeply affects the way that we relate to ourselves and God and others. However, there's really good news, because in the midst of all of this, neuroscientists have discovered that the flow of information, while it starts from the bottom up and then right to left, it actually also goes the other way, although it never starts from left to right and top to bottom. Once the information gets into the prefrontal cortex, it's made explicit, then you can actually play with it. And you can re-remember things that have happened to you in the past. And that re-remembering and re-informing through a process called integration actually can rewire the brain, which is crazy. Like, it's called neuroplasticity. Your brain will literally form new neurons that will travel down new neural pathways and will cause your brain to function in a healthier way than it did prior when it was stuck in a bunch of trauma. And that's why, from a physiological standpoint, spiritual transformation into Christ-likeness is a physical process. God created us embodied. We are physical creatures. He cares deeply about our bodies. So much so that when we're actually transformed into Christ-likeness, our bodies, through the neural process, actually begin to change. Like physically. I mean, that's really cool. So hopefully through this session, you've gained a deeper understanding of how information flows, where trauma gets stuck, where trauma might be stuck in your life right now, and the implications for the importance of raising that stuck, disintegrated information to the level of awareness so that the truth can be spoken into it. You can have a positive experience with someone who deeply cares about you to facilitate growth into Christ-likeness, which is a physical process. And that's our prayer for you guys.